When newly elected Congressman Ritchie Torres arrived in Washington in January, his presence was already historic as the first Afro-Latino openly gay man elected to the House of Representatives.
Fight for Trump! Fight for Trump!
But as it turned out, the history-making was just getting started.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength.
We are following breaking news at this hour. These are pro-Trump supporters who have taken to the steps of the Capitol.
I've never been more overwhelmed in my life.
House Resolution 24, impeaching Donald John Trump.
The sheer range of issues that come before a member of Congress and the complexity of those issues is unlike anything I've seen.
For Torres, the introduction was bracing, but far from the first challenge he's faced. Raised in a housing project and struggling with issues all too common among his friends and neighbors, he's risen to represent the poorest congressional district in the U.S. with determination and independence. I spoke to the congressman about how his journey from poverty to the national stage has shaped his unique political perspective.
My story is the story of the Bronx. It's a story of struggle, but it's also one of overcoming.
Well, Congressman Torres, thank you so much for doing this. Tell me, just to start, tell me a little bit about the beginning, because it so informs how you are doing this job. Tell me about growing up, because it was not easy.
I was born and raised in the Bronx. I spent almost all my life in poverty. I was raised by a single mother who had to raise 3 children on minimum wage. I grew up in public housing. And what I remember above all is the living conditions. The conditions of mold and mildew and leaks and lead. The struggle to breathe in my own home. You know, as a child, I was repeatedly in the hospital for asthma, largely caused by housing conditions like vermin and molds. And I actually grew up in a public housing development right across the street from Trump Golf Course. And while the government was investing more than $100 million in a golf course for Donald Trump, you know, I saw the conditions in my own home get worse every single day. And I remember asking myself at the time, what does it say about our society that we're willing to invest more in a golf course than in the homes of low-income Black and brown New Yorkers? It was as if I was living a tale of two cities.
And tell me about the Bronx. I mean, what constitutes it? What makes it what it is?
The Bronx is the comeback county of New York. During the 1970s, the Bronx was plagued with disinvestment and arson and abandonment. And the people of the Bronx, instead of leaving the city, largely stood here and rebuilt and revitalized the Bronx. The Bronx has its fair share of challenges, but we have some of the most resilient people you'll ever meet. And the resilience of the Bronx came to light powerfully during COVID-19. It's the home of essential workers who put their lives at risk during the peak of the pandemic so that most of us could safely shelter in place.
Resilience has been a through line of Torres' life, and nowhere has that been more apparent than his battle with depression and anxiety. Bringing those struggles to the fore has turned him into a powerful advocate for mental health awareness. You've been very public about your struggles with your own mental health and have drawn a lot of accolades for that. What convinced you that you had this mission?
The experience of coming out as a gay man inspired me to be open and honest about every aspect of my life, including my struggles with depression. I became the first openly LGBTQ elected official from the Bronx in 2013. But several years before then, I was at the lowest point in my life. I was struggling with depression. I had dropped out of college. I lost a close friend to an opioid overdose. There were moments when I thought of taking my own life because I felt as if the world around me had collapsed. I felt a profound sense of failure. And as a public figure, I feel a particular sense of obligation to be honest about my struggles with mental illness. It's important for people to know, I would not be alive today were it not for the power of mental health, which saved my life.
The Bronx is populated with characters and kindred spirits committed to tackling systemic injustices by working in and leveraging the system. Few know this better than longtime politician Jimmy Vaca, who represented the borough on the New York City Council and served as a mentor to Ritchie Torres. One person, and if we can look at the first clip, the Jimmy Vaca clip, if you can hand that to the congressman.
Without hurting anyone's feelings in my profession, many politicians are glad-handers. Ritchie is not. Ritchie is a strategic policy type of wonk who thinks of how to correct what's wrong from a legislative point of view, from a policy point of view. He was head of the investigations committee of the New York City Council. And the last investigation Ritchie conducted with his staff was finding out that the head of the New York City Police Department's Human Rights Division engaged in racism, homophobia, and anti-Semitic remarks. And that person is no longer in the New York City Police Department. Ritchie pursued that. Ritchie got answers. Ritchie took action. So Ritchie is persistent. Ritchie knows exactly what he's doing, and when he's in the room, there will be accountability.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to start with Jimmy Vaca as a key figure, it sounds like, in your life. I mean, someone who you went to work for. He identified you, I believe, when you were a student volunteer, and it really did, sort of set you on a path to where you are today. Tell me about the beginnings of that.
Well, with the exception of my mother, Jimmy Vaca has been the most formative figure in my life. Back in 2005, Jimmy was looking for a young student to serve as his district manager for a day. So I met Jimmy, I spent a day with him, interacting with constituents, and it was the first time I could see myself as a public servant. I enjoyed just the time I spent with people, listening to their problems, figuring out how to solve those problems. And after that encounter with Jimmy Vaca, I set such a strong impression on him that he eventually brought me onto his campaign.
Vaca's encouragement and support led Torres to quickly broaden his portfolio, putting him directly in charge of solving complex and important issues and finding success. His ambition blossomed to stepping out on his own to seek public office, his own seat on the city council. But there was a small problem you don't normally associate with aspiring politicians.
I'm new at this, forgive me.
In my early years in politics, I found the experience of public speaking to be so unnerving that I would have to drink a glass of wine before delivering a speech or before knocking on someone's door.
We're here to say no to creating separate and unequal schools.
Over time, I became much more accustomed to it, and it's second nature to me. But I found the experience of speaking in public and the sheer amount of retail politicking, to be draining for me as an introvert, to be anxiety-inducing.
And yet, you kept with it. What was it that made it worthwhile?
I felt the weight of leadership and responsibility on my shoulders. And that motivated me to campaign my heart out.
I'm running because I want to be part of a city council that gives everyday people a chance.
I was one of 9 candidates when I first ran for the city council back in 2013, and very few people thought I would win. But I won because I knocked on thousands of doors, and people came to see their hopes and dreams for their children embodied in my candidacy, in my story.
So there are a number of people who would be quite content and have been more than content to serve as a city council member for the biggest and some would argue the greatest city in America, maybe the world. And yet you make a decision to take it a step further to run for Congress. Tell me about that decision.
I came to realize that there was a limit to what I could do at the local level. And so I had an epiphany that if I want to become a transformational policymaker, if I want to have a systemic impact in improving life and public housing, in breaking the cycle of racially concentrated poverty, then I have to be in Washington, D.C., because that's where the rules are set. And so I ran for Congress. And I ran in the most fiercely contested congressional primary in New York City. I was one of 11 candidates. The race included the vice chair of the DNC, the former speaker of the New York City Council, a candidate endorsed by Bernie Sanders, and the most formidable opponent was a man by the name of Ruben Diaz Sr., who was known to be the most anti-LGBTQ elected official in New York state politics. And for me, the triumph of an openly LGBTQ candidate is a powerful testament to how far we've come as a society. And I often point out, who would have thought that the first openly LGBTQ member of the New York City congressional delegation would come not from Chelsea or the Village or Hell's Kitchen, but from the South Bronx.
Another way Torres has challenged expectations as a councilman and a congressman is his willingness to engage with New York City's business community. It's a move that in recent times carries significantly more risk, especially for a politician embracing a progressive agenda. He caught the attention of Kathy Wild, CEO of the Partnership for New York City. She represents some of the most powerful and wealthy business interests in New York. I want to bring in one more clip if we can.
I'm afraid to listen because I know Kathy does not suffer fools. So.
She does not, but I'm interested to get your reaction to this. Go ahead.
Yes, I met Ritchie early in his tenure on the city council, 2014, when he first started, and he wasn't ideological. He hadn't stereotyped business as being the bad guys. He was really open and interested. He represents the poorest congressional district, or certainly one of them, in the country. And yet he didn't see the wealthy, the CEOs, as being a negative force. He was looking for them to come into his community, help with the development of affordable housing. Ritchie made it clear that government does not have all the solutions. And there's hardly any political person around these days who sees the world that way. So yes, he's courageous. And he's willing to stand up and say, I'm going to be my own person.
So an interesting perspective from someone who knows the corridors of power for sure. Tell me about how you approach what has become a hot button issue, which is wealth and money in this big city that we live in.
You know, as a city council member, I'm willing to speak to Kathy. I'm willing to speak to the businesses that she represents in order to understand the industries that government are regulating. Does it mean that I'm necessarily going to agree on every issue? No. But I feel it's important to disagree without demonizing. You know, there are those who approach politics with the fundamentalism of a religion, right? There are those who essentially say, I alone have the absolute truth. My policy prescriptions are the only path to salvation. And anyone who disagrees with me is not simply wrong, but evil, and should be burned at the stake for heresy. You know, from my vantage point, that kind of fundamentalism is incompatible with the very nature of politics, which is about compromise and coalition building and mutual understanding.
So I have to ask you, as we start to wrap up here, about 3 Wednesdays, your first 3 Wednesdays as a member of Congress. I don't even know where to begin other than to say, what were those 3 Wednesdays like?
I refer to it as the 3 wildest Wednesdays. On January 6th, insurrection. On January 13th, impeachment. And on January 20th, inauguration. This has been the most dramatic and draining and disorienting month for any freshman class in the modern history of the United States.
Do you solemnly swear that you will support and defend?
I suspect the freshman class that entered Congress during the Civil War had much more drama than we did, but by contemporary standards, the drama that we've seen in January is second to none. The siege on the Capitol was reminiscent of 9/11. I had the same sense of shock on January 6th that I had on 9/11.
Stop the steal! Stop the steal! Stop the steal!
I was in a state of shock that a violent mob would so willingly and could so easily storm the Capitol and invade the Senate chamber and terrorize members of Congress and their staff.
Everybody stay down! Get down!
And I have a number of colleagues who are struggling with post-traumatic stress in the wake of the siege.
And so as you settle in, even with that as a backdrop, how are you finding it? What is it like?
COVID is a challenge. Congress is a collegial institution. You're only as strong as the relationships you build, because the goal is to leverage those relationships in the service of solving problems and passing legislation. And COVID-19 has hamstrung the ability to build relationships. So it's been eventful.
And do you look at the district differently now? How does it feel to you? How does it look to you now that you are representing it in Washington, representing these people that you grew up among? How do you think of yourself differently, I guess, now that you're in the seat?
As a member of Congress, I'm not simply a representative of the South Bronx. I'm approaching issues that have implications for national security and the international community. Whether it's terrorism or the SolarWinds hacking of government and corporate networks, these are issues that transcend the provincial concerns of a particular congressional district. And it's important for me as a member of Congress to be engaged on those issues, to understand them deeply, so that I can legislate thoughtfully. But first and foremost, I am a representative of the South Bronx. My mother has taught me that the most important lesson is to never forget where you come from. Never forget where your roots lie, never forget the people who voted you into office. I want people to say, my life is better for having known Ritchie Torres. If people say that, then I know mine has been a life well lived.